I think one of the myths that we have seen over the past few years that has been very persistent in the European policy discourse has that there is a number of problems when it comes to China on various issues, but that we have to be partners on climate change because it's a global phenomenon. And I would say that myth needs to be debunked. We're not really partners with China when it comes to climate change. Each of us needs to do their share at home. This comes very much down to domestic policies, and our ability to influence China's domestic policy processes is very much limited.
Is Germany's new government shifting its tone on China?
Yes, that is certainly something we can observe at the moment. This coalition treaty, in comparison to the previous coalition treaties, is really, I would almost say, spectacularly new. The language that is found, that is clearly based on the new dimension of systemic rivalry and the question of a stronger and tougher line when it comes to China. That is definitely something new. And this government will also act on these issues.
How does it compare to the last coalition? What's the main difference?
The era under Chancellor Merkel was very much defined by a term that is used in German, Wandel durch Handel. So by trading with each other, China will become more like us. It will be more market-oriented. It will become freer, and somehow, we will find a good way through difficulties. Both sides will benefit from this kind of trade. And what we can definitely observe now at the end of this era of Chancellor Merkel is that this has not come true. This does not mean that all businesses will now leave China, that there will be no more trade between China and Germany, but it will be a significant recalibration of the importance of the Chinese market and the importance of trade with China, and we will see a bigger focus on competitiveness issues and the question of how do we compete with China on third markets, how do we compete with China in other parts of the world.
What does the EU want to achieve with China on foreign policy level?
What we can see at the moment is an interesting test case that is playing out in the Baltics. Lithuania has decided to challenge China when it comes to its own relationship with Taiwan. It is a case of China using economic coercive measures, so its own market, its own power, its own economic power, to assert its political will upon EU member states. And that is spectacular in a way because it really challenges what the EU is all about, and that is the coherence of the single market, the standing up for each other around these issues, and it requires an enormous amount of EU solidarity to deal with these questions. And what the EU would like to achieve is an equilibrium where one can trade with each other, where one can solve these global questions, where one can have a positive relationship, but it doesn't seem that that is in the interest of the Chinese leadership at this very point in time. The kind of Europeans have to readjust their own preferences and their own priorities around this. Our relative economic strength when it comes to China continues to shrink, and China's relative strength continues to grow. So over the course of time, our position will become weaker. Having this instance of kind of China using very clear economic coercive measures right now is actually good because it forces us in Europe to ask the right questions about how we relate to each other, but how we also relate to China in the years to come.
How can EU and China cooperate and compete for a green future?
So I think rather than hiding behind the fact that we have to work together some sort of way to fight climate change, we have to understand the reality that is going to be one where particularly this part of our relationship is going to be increasingly competitive. When it comes to market shares for renewable energy technologies, green technologies, when it comes to who owns the technologies of the future, China is going to be a massive and fierce competitor, particularly for a country like Germany. We have to retain the ability in Europe to also be able to produce and procure wind turbines, solar panels, batteries, and we are at a moment where we could risk losing all of these capacities to China because of the dominance of Chinese players in these sectors. And that would actually be a huge problem for our energy security in the future. But I do think we need to look at both sides of this coin, the competitive and the cooperative dynamic, and we have overemphasized in the past the cooperative dynamic, and I think we really, really need to look into the competitive dimension of this as well.
How can we cooperate and engage so closely with China if we take into account its human rights record?
We're seeing that cooperation with China is becoming more difficult because Chinese actions domestically are becoming much more problematic for us to digest. So the fact that the European Parliament has actually announced sanctions with regard to China's violations of human rights in Xinjiang for the first time since 1989 on like a human rights basis. So these sanctions being announced is something new. And China has responded to that quite aggressively as well by sanctioning European parliamentarians, by sanctioning European think tanks, by sanctioning individuals. This matters to China. International reputation matters to China. When a company is selling a lot of goods to the West, where consumers are asking these questions about the supply chain, are asking whether there's forced labor involved when their t-shirt is being produced, then this becomes an actual issue for a company to decide, what is more important, the Western market, the Chinese market, where are my consumers, where are my preferences? So this will become increasingly a bone of contention between Europe and China, and it will force companies and individuals and governments to make tougher choices in the future.